Hi, my name is Jackie Gutierrez. I am with the California Restaurant Association, and this is Ask CRA on the Confidential Bulletin. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'm joined by Bruno Katz and John Guarino at Wilson Elser. They'll be sharing key compliance considerations and practical tips for navigating mental health awareness in the workplace. I will now turn it over to Bruno.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask CRA. As I indicated, I'm Bruno Katz, and my colleague here, John Guarino, is with me. So, mental health burnout in the workplace, it is a serious consideration and issue. Restaurants are high volume issues. There is a lot of people going on. There are servers, there are front of the house people, there are greeters. There's the back of the house, the heart of the house, as we like to call it. The chefs, the cooks, and everything. And it can get intense, especially when it gets busy. And one of the things that you've got to watch out for from a mental health standpoint is making sure your employees, you recognize the signs and making sure your employees are in good spirits. I mean, just some statistics, employees that, feel cared for and feel taken care of report 3.8 times. They're more likely to report well being if you talk to them and take see with them. If you have employees that you take consideration of, they're about 2.4 times more engaged, and they're also almost twice more productive. So taking care of mental health is an important issue. And from a legal standpoint, being lawyers and everything, we kind of frame it as a legal health and risk assessment as well as an operational issues. And we want to talk about it from a practical manager actions. I mean, managers need to be aware of who their employees are. I mean, one of the things I talk about all the time with managers and engaging with managers is you better darn well be sure you know how to pronounce their names, because the name is the most important thing. If you don't know how to pronounce someone's name, your credibility goes way down. So, John, let me ask you this question. I mean, does mental health qualify as a disability under laws of California?
Absolutely, Bruno. It's one of the protected categories. It also can run into issues related to workplace accommodations. And I think what can be tricky with this, Bruno, is a lot of times people think mental health. Well, I'm just running a shift. I'm just managing. They got the busters and the waiters. Why am I talking about mental health? But it shows up in a lot of different ways. Call outs, people being burnt out, conflict between employees. People getting overwhelmed mid shift, and identifying it and be able to work with it is a really important part.
I mean, one of the other things is if you identify a worker that's, mental burnout, or they come and approach you that you're mental burnout, it triggers certain duties. And we like to call it the interactive process. And what is the interactive process? John, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So the interactive process isn't a checklist. It isn't a set thing. It's about being reasonable and about being engaged and talking to your employee about what their issues are and exploring what kind of accommodations or adjustments to the work schedule you can make. There is no one size fits all, and a lot of times companies will get in trouble and get in themselves in a legal pickle if they go ahead and try to say this is my policy. When X happens, we do Y. That's not the interactive process. That's a blanket policy that, unless it is always in the favor of the employee, is probably going to get you in trouble. So the interactive process, in short, is a discussion with the employee about their problems and potential solutions.
And along those lines, it's important when you have that discussion, and it's a real discussion. It's not a cursory discussion. You have to be engaged with your employees. You have to ask them, "How are you feeling?" If they say, "I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling burnt out," you have to recognize that issue and tell them, "Look, uh, I need to talk to you about it, but I also need to get a sense of what's going on," and that includes giving us a sense from a medical care provider of whether you have limitations. And we call those accommodations. And so you have a duty to try to discuss with them and talk about reasonable accommodations. Now, understand, people are going to ask for all kinds of accommodations, and they not may not be reasonable. For example, when you're in the heart of the house, back of the house, and you're cook and a chef, they may say, "Well, I'm not able to sit," or "I only can sit doing this work." That's probably not a reasonable accommodation, because you need to be standing, you need to be on your feet. But from a mental health standpoint, you need to see what is a reasonable accommodation, not an unreasonable accommodation. Um, if the accommodation is I need to have, time off every couple days, maybe that's something you could accommodate based on scheduling and having other employees. But if it means I only can work 2 hours at a time because I'm so stressed out, that might not be a reasonable accommodation because you might not have the ability to have people coming in, especially as cooks and chef, only working 2 hour shifts. So you need to make sure the accommodation, and what do you need to do when you have those discussions, John? What do you think is important from a managerial standpoint?
I was going to ask you, Bruno, and I wanted to talk about having these conversations, what you're allowed to ask and how much you're allowed to dig into. Can you go ahead and ask things like, "What's your diagnosis?" or "What medication are you on?" or "Really, are you seriously depressed?" Um, and I think that's the tricky issue because you shouldn't be asking questions like that. You shouldn't be minimizing what they're going through and say, "Hey, everyone's stressed, just deal with it." But you need to strike that balance between finding out the information for the interactive process and not going too far into their private medical issues. You could ask things like, how is this affecting work? What difficulty are you having? What is it that you're having difficulty with? Is there something that you think may be able to help you perform your job? And then that relates back to what you talked about, Bruno, with reasonable. If the answer is yes, I'd like to get paid and do nothing. Obviously, we would all like that. That's not a reasonable accommodation. But making sure that you don't um, minimize and express that a lack of acceptance of the issue that they're having. Everyone's stressed, or going too far into their medical issues. Those are two kind of things that you want to watch out for.
If they are asking for time off, it's important to get something from a medical care provider that tells you what they can and can't do. And so that's important. But definitely, that you do not have a right to get into their privacy uh, rights. But you know, and really, a trigger here, which is important to know, is you it doesn't become an issue until they raise it as an issue. I mean, if you see there's a person struggling, you should have a discussion with them about the strugglingness, but you shouldn't certainly not ask them, are you feeling depressed? Are you having a medical issue? But if you see someone struggling, you need to communicate that. But until they tell you, oh, look, I have an issue, I have a problem, it doesn't raise the duty to interact and have the interactive process and talk about the accommodation. So it is very important that you don't pry too heavily into their privacy. But once they ask for time off, once they say they have a medical issue, you do have a right to ask them. And the questions like John talked about, what do you need to do to perform your job? What can be done? And if you as a manager aren't feeling comfortable doing that, what other resources can restaurateurs have in doing this?
Well, Bruno, before we jump to that, you use the term manager. And I think it's important here that we make sure that we're not just leaving this at the general manager's job or the main manager. That this is kind of anybody in a supervisory role needs to be aware of these. A lot of times we see cases where the shift lead or the assistant manager was told something and it ever got passed up the chain. Making sure your folks know to be on the lookout for these kind of comments, for these kind of issues, and Bruno and I are both old Navy guys. There's a good Navy rule that says you never want to be the last person with a secret. Make sure you've passed it up. And these mental health issues, these workplace accommodation issues, that's a good rule as well. But your shift lead may not know that that's their responsibility. So it's on you to make sure you're putting the training out to your people. So now to get to the question you asked, Bruno, which was a great one, where do you go? I mean, passing it up the chain, and HR should be an important part of that chain, so that you shouldn't just have your shift leads or your assistant manager trying to figure this out on their own. They should be in close coordination with HR. And, that's what we're here for too, the lawyers. No one likes to talk to the lawyers, but we are definitely here, whether it's us or some of our colleagues, to help you through some of these tricky situations.
So, and the other thing is when you have these conversations, it's vitally important to document the conversations, what you discussed about, whether you journal it or some way, but document it. Make sure you document because if something were to come on and somebody were to allege that you didn't have a discussion about a mental health issue and they bring some kind of litigation, you need to have documentation that on such and such a date here on April 29th, 2026, I had a conversation with John about this. So documentation is the key. John, let's go on to another issue that what if you feel like if you have an employee that you think is taking advantage of the system, how do you avoid a potential prevention or provincial problem arising from a mental health standpoint?
That's a great question, Bruno. And I think really, in today's environment where people say I need a mental health day, or they use that term so freely, or that concept so freely, it can be frustrating for employers when you feel like someone is taking advantage of it or making a mountain out of a molehill. Regardless of what your feelings are, your reaction, your employees' reactions to this situation is going to be 90% of the time what creates or prevents liability. So do not dismiss the concerns. I mentioned before, don't say, hey, everybody's stressed. It's hard. Life's hard. Those kind of comments are problematic. Don't get frustrated. Don't take quick or reactive reactions where you are changing schedules that can seem retaliatory. This can create claims of disability discrimination, failure to accommodate, or as I just said, retaliation. It is important that we take deep breaths even when we're getting frustrated and we have those conversations back to what you talked about, Bruno, which is what do you think we can do for you? And we have the interactive process and we find what is a reasonable accommodation. If we reach the point where we think that the accommodation they're asking for is not reasonable, there are the next steps that we can take to deny an accommodation and say, hey, we can't accommodate that. That's not reasonable. But that has its own wickets and hoops that you've got to jump through that are more difficult to do if a harsh comment is said or if it's documented that you dismiss the concerns.
So we talked about this and we talked about documentation. I just want to kind of give from a standpoint of what are you looking for where you think there might be issues involving stress. So, you all of a sudden have a high performer. People are doing a great job. They're doing great work. And all of a sudden, magically, they seemed a little bit off. They're producing lower quality work. They seem a little more withdrawn. They seem a little bit more silent than normal. They're kind of appearing overwhelmed. And then all of a sudden, you magically have a change in attendance and punctuality. That all could be triggers in something to look at from a supportive standpoint from an employee. So I think it's important to monitor and watch these things where you have a high level performing employee and you're starting to see these things. And so maybe at that point you want to be honest with them. You want to have a discussion from a performance standpoint. We're seeing this. We have a concern. This could all be trigger of a possible mental issue. And when you do talk to them in that way, and on another podcast we're going to talk about this a little bit, but it's important to approach them in gentle, non-judgmental language. Kind of, I'm here to support you. We want to make you succeed. How can we help you succeed? Are you struggling with any issues? We're seeing this. How can we help you? So you want to approach it from that standpoint. You definitely don't want to approach it in aggressive, really, you're really an idiot or something like that. You're really doing poorly. You want to look as, managers that talk, supervisors that talk in a calm, quiet tone will get a better sense of what's going on with the employees, and the employees will feel more open to have discussions with them and talk to them about what's going on. So when you do have one of these issues where you're having this issue about stress and anxiety, are there other concerns, John, from the standpoint of documenting these issues and dealing with the responses?
Yeah, absolutely. One, on documenting, don't only document what you're doing and what you should document what they've said to you as well. A lot of the times we see these cases where it comes in through a text message. Make sure the text message went to the shift lead or went to a coworker, that you're getting that text message, you're printing it out, you're saving it in the file. It is so much easier to get the stuff when it's happening now than it is to try to recreate it after you get the demand letter or, God forbid, the lawsuit. So make sure you're documenting that. But more kind of related, Bruno, and I think this is where you were going with this, is in addition to kind of the documenting and protecting yourself and protecting your company, we also want to be protecting our employees. And this relates to workplace violence. I think mental health issues and an employee who's having mental health issues and we're not taking care of them or identifying it and addressing it can lead to workplace violence, which one is, obviously something we want to avoid from a human aspect, but from a legal aspect, there are some requirements with this, right? We have to make sure that we have our written workplace violence prevention plan. We have to make sure that we're complying with the annual training for employees and managers related to this. We have to make sure that we have a procedure for reporting and responding to incidents of this. And we have to have an incident log. I'm going to call it recent, but it's relatively recent changes in the law related to this. If you're not up to speed on these, again, let us know, reach out, talk to us, take a look at at California's websites that they have on these. But workplace violence requirements have increased in the past years.
And here's some of the warning signs you can think of just from a general standpoint. Like I talked behavioral changes. All of a sudden, people are becoming more withdrawn. And then all of a sudden they're becoming more aggressive. They're getting more aggressive with other people. If you're starting to hear threats, if they're fixated on conflict about something, you know, I'm going to take it in my own hands. These are all warning signs to watch from a workplace standpoint. And it's important to have an environment. And I know it's tough in a restaurant, and we see this all the time. John and I actually had a case where we were dealing with the heart of the house, the kitchen area. It is a high stress place. You're getting a lot of orders. You're getting a lot of things, and we actually had it where we were picking a jury in a case involving it, and the jurors kept saying, I worked in a kitchen. It was horrible. The chefs are about the worst people. They're always screaming at people and yelling at people and telling them they're stupid and everything like that. As a leader, as a shift lead, as a cook, as a anything, you need to be gentle, you need to be calm, firm. If you need to be firm about performance, that's fine. But yelling, screaming, dropping, swearing, none of that leads to openness and credibility. And so a good environment reduces the risk. A bad environment, a high stress environment, you have higher risk from every standpoint. So, John, how would you summarize this as to, dealing with mental health if you can?
Absolutely. I think we got to take mental health concerns seriously. We want to be on the lookout for them. There's no magic words, but be on the lookout for the things that Bruno talked about and any other indication that you may have. I want you to think about it not only in terms of taking care of your people, which should be your number one concern, but also in terms of accommodations, workplace accommodations. Mental health is a disability, a condition under California law that requires us to do that. Document the issues, document the actions that you take, document the evidence that supports it, like text messages, and make sure that your folks know to escalate and not be the last person with the secret when this is going on. Finally, when it comes to workplace violence, make sure you're aware of your policy, procedure requirements, and your training requirements, and you're complying with California law when it comes to that.
And so to wrap this all up, it really, from a managerial supervisory standpoint, the way you respond and deal with this and using the tools determines whether you have a safe environment, a productive environment, an environment that cares about their employees and reduces and prevents the risks of legal issues. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye bye.